Well, hello, everybody. I'm so glad you can join me this afternoon. I've been looking forward to this. Before I start, I want to thank all my friends and mentors at Goodwin Conservation Center for getting me on the path of paying attention to pretty much all the life I can see in my own yard. And what I want to share with you today is things that I've seen in the past 5 years. Let's just get started with sharing the screen. Desktop 1, share. Is that what I do, Bryan?
Yep.
Say share and then go to this and say click. And say slideshow, play from start. I am not a very experienced Zoom host,
Perfect.
but I think this is good. Can you all see the pollinators in our yards? Good. I'm also not an entomologist. I probably don't know as much about insects as many of you, because I know you're all interested in natural history. But I do watch them and I do photograph them, though I'm not a great hotshot photographer either. I have an iPhone with a little macro lens on it, and I use it all the time. This is a honeybee that you're seeing right there on an aster flower. I'm going to be talking for the next 40 minutes or so. I don't want to keep you all past, dinner preparation time. This is not going to go till 7 o'clock. We'll be out of here by 6. But I want to talk about the pollinators and the pollinatees, because they form a unit in our backyards. Let's just start by looking at some insects. This is a video I made in the fall of 2017. It's October when these chrysanthemums bloom. I'm following the clouded sulfur, that greenish yellow butterfly, watching it as it makes its way around the disc flowers of a chrysanthemum. And now I'm suddenly noticing other insects on the patch of flowers. I can see a lightning bug, and a dronefly, a few droneflies. I'm just watching what everybody's doing. You notice how they're all interested in the yellow stuff at the center of the flower. And that's because that's where the pollen is. And they're looking for food. The beetles are also looking for food. You'll see a green beetle at some point. There he is. He just eats the petals. He doesn't care about nectar or pollen, he just eats petals. So it's quite a restaurant here in the backyard. And it was really this experience of seeing how many different kinds of insects I could find on one small patch of flowers that got me going on this journey of learning about them. So what is pollination? As you all probably remember from some early botany course, this is pollen. Can you see my cursor on the screen? Can everybody see my cursor? Okay. These are pollen grains, and the sexual life of any flowering plant involves pollen in a stamen getting in touch with the stigma, which is the female part of the plant, and sending a pollen tube down to the ovary where the ovules are. And this is where fertilization happens, and this is how we get seeds and fruit. It's the outer part of the ovary that becomes a fruit in a vegetable like a tomato, and fruit like a tomato. But this can't happen without some kind of agent to get the pollen to the stigma. That's the thing with plants. They can't get together by themselves. Wind pollinates some plants, and others need the help of third-party sexual intermediaries, which is where our insect pollinators come in. It takes 3 to tango. Many of our cultivated plants require help with pollen transfer. They require insect help. The squash family, and the nightshades, the rose family, all those berries and apples and pears. and blueberries and cranberries in his family. Now, in 2017, right about the same time that I took that video, and at the same time that I was finishing up the Master Naturalist program at Goodwin, I heard the report from Germany that scientists had discovered that the biomass of insects in Germany had decreased by something like 70% over the last 30 years. They've been, just collecting bugs and figuring out how many there were. And this was rather alarming. And then I heard that in China, as much as 80% of the native honeybee population had disappeared. Well, this has been called the insect apocalypse, and it's attributed to death by 1,000 cuts, global warming and storms, and mostly loss of habitat through human agency, deforestation, agricultural intensification, introduced species, but especially, and I would say most especially, the use of insecticides to kill insects. So here we have at the center of this very, alarming story, we've got the bumblebee and the clover. Now, bees are keystone species, which are organisms that help define an entire ecosystem. Without its keystone species, an ecosystem will change dramatically or cease to exist altogether. So you have to worry a little bit when you hear that 80% of China's bees are disappearing. Well, in China, there are provinces where they have disappeared. They are locally extinct thanks to the use of heavy insecticide applications to control pests. You have people doing the work that bees used to do, climbing up in trees with feather dusters. They use chicken feathers to move pollen from the stamens to the stigmas of pear trees in this case. Well, the good news is, if they were to stop using the insecticides and reintroduce some insects, they'd probably come right back and flourish as they used to. Insect populations are very resistant. When you think about it, there are 4,000 species of bees in the United States alone, and 300 species of native bees in Connecticut alone. And all of these bees, in Connecticut anyway, have been here, have established themselves since the last glaciation. There were no bees here 20,000 years ago. And then after the glacier receded 10,000 years ago or so, plants started moving north, and the insect populations moved with them. The other thing is that they move only as fast as they can fly, and so they become locally established. If you have bees in your backyard, well, they're not flying around just for sightseeing purposes. They want to live in your backyard and get their needs met there. That's what they're after. They want to eat and reproduce right where they are. They don't want to spend all their energy just flying around. So if they come to visit you, you might think about how they might stay and think of your yard as sort of their home as well. Here we have a little competition going on. So let's start on bees. Bees are the keystone pollinators. There are other pollinators, and I'll talk about them too. We'll start with the bees. An insect is a bee if it's got long antennae. Every one of these has long-ish antennae, wider than their head. And they have compound eyes on the sides of their faces. Like this is a honeybee's eyes. You can very often distinguish a bee just by looking at its eyes. And they all are fuzzy, almost all fuzzy, to one degree or another, and in one part of their body or another. The common eastern bumblebee is very fuzzy on its the back of its thorax, and European honeybee is very fuzzy kind of all over. It even has hairs in its eyeballs. And the leaf-cutting bees often are very hairy and fuzzy on their lower abdomens, and so on. The carpenter bee has a bare abdomen, but lots of fuzz on its thorax. And this is one way you can tell how cold the temperatures are that they can sustain, that they can endure, because the fuzz keeps them warm. And the size, I've tried to represent them sort of with relative sizes here. The carpenter bee is our largest bee, and the bumblebee is a little smaller than that. And they go all the way on down. There are lots of really tiny bees, but some of the smallest I can see in my yard are the mining bees. And what they're about is gathering pollen and nectar, because this is their food. They're going to the restaurant or the grocery store of your flowers and collecting nectar, which is sugar, and pollen, which is very nutritious but largely protein, and taking them back to, in the case of honeybees, this is a honeybee, taking them back to the hive. And honeybees need to be able to survive the winter, so they have a whole comb devoted to food storage. The honeybee has been collecting nectar into a nectar stomach in her body, and she flies back and she feeds that to another bee who feeds it to another bee, and it all ends up in the comb. And you can see that they segregate kinds of nectar by color, which have to do with the source of the nectar. The nectar is colored, as is the pollen. And the beekeepers all know which color is represented by by the nectar in the pollen. In a different part of the hive, there's a place for pollen storage, which is the pollen is mixed with nectar to make food for baby bees. And here we have baby bees getting started and growing into larger larvae, which will become honeybees. Now, all of that nectar was collected in the honey stomach, or the nectar sac. The pollen is collected separately by the hairs of the honeybees over here, and consistently groomed into its pollen baskets, which are spaces on the hind legs where they can pack it in. Bumblebees also have pollen baskets, and these are like hollow spaces in the legs where they can use this squeezing motion between the two parts of the leg to just press pollen up into the corbicula. This is a half full basket, pollen basket. And when it's really full, that's what it looks like. And that's when this bee is probably ready to go back to the hive. Bumblebees have a different life cycle. They don't overwinter as a colony. At the end of the summer, what they're going to do is mate and produce mated queens that overwinter. But they overwinter in a hibernatory state under the ground or in a hollow space, protected space. They don't need winter food. So all they're doing all summer is making baby bees out of pollen and nectar. Here's a sweat bee, very messy hairdo, doesn't do any grooming while it's flying around, just collects pollen and sweeps it all into its nest when it gets home. These are pollen grains all magnified within the scopae, which are the hairs, the fuzzy hairs of the sweat bee. And there's its larvae underground. So when you see bees in the summer, you think that they live outdoors all the time. Well, it's about half and half. They're out foraging, and then the next thing you know, they're back under the ground. That's where they have their work to make new bees. Miner bees, again, very fuzzy. They comb their pollen directly into nest cells. These ones make their cells like this, looks like this underground, with the tunnels where the larvae develop on little balls of pollen and nectar. And when you see them emerging in the spring, or even throughout the season, it's in these little things that look like anthills. Now, here's a carpenter bee, big guy, no pollen basket. He might look like a bumblebee, but he has a shiny abdomen and a shiny circle in the middle of his back, whereas the bumblebee's is rather fuzzy, and no pollen baskets. Yes, scope A, but not this. And they're considered to be good pollinators because they have long tongues and they can get into some kinds of long, trumpety flowers that other bees can't get into. And of course, we know what they do with their nests, right? They want to nest in their houses. Oh well. Now there are bee mimics that are also considered to be good pollinators. They're flies, flower flies. And when I first discovered the flower flies, I was a little repulsed because I've never really liked flies. I don't like the way they do this with their hands. Just kept away from them. But I realized that they're doing the same work. This is a flower fly that looks like a bumblebee. He's a mimic of a bumblebee, but you can tell he's not a bumblebee right off by looking at the antennae, because they're little. All flies have small antennae like that, and all bees have long ones. And that's sometimes the only way you can tell. Here's a calligrapher fly that wants you to think it's a honeybee, but it doesn't have the antennae, so you know it's not. And none of the bees have pollen baskets. They also have a different kind of eye. Here's a honeybee eye. Here's an Eastern calligrapher fly eye. It looks like aviator goggles to me. And here's two different kinds of flower flies. Not exactly fighting, but yep, that one won. Yep, it's big. We also have to consider the diurnal moths and the nocturnal moths as pollinators. They often are very furry, and as they fly from one plant to another collecting nectar, they're not just drinking nectar. They're adults. They're not collecting pollen. They're just collecting sugar energy for flight. But they do spread pollen from one plant to another. Here's one called a green-eyed moth. And if you look closely, you can see why it's called that. It's doing just what the bees do. It's sticking its proboscis into one open flower at the periphery of the disc after another, very methodically. It's skipping all those unopened flowers in the center of the disc. And there's also all the butterflies. Now, butterflies are the ones that bring great joy when we see them in our gardens, in our yards. The tiger swallowtail, and the spicebush swallowtail, and the black swallowtail, and the great spangled fritillary, and the painted lady, and the monarch, of course. These are flagship species. We don't absolutely need them, perhaps, for pollination as much as we need the bees. But wherever there are butterflies, you have good bee habitat, good pollinator habitat. And the larvae of those beautiful butterflies are food for baby birds. So we want to encourage them in our yards too. Here's all the larvae that will turn into those beautiful butterflies, which is any habitat that's good for them is also good for bees. So we're about halfway through. Here's the how-to part, how not to attract pollinators. There's a study from the UConn Center for Land Use Education and Research that has found that over the past 2 decades, lawn grass has outpaced agriculture as Connecticut's leading crop, with more than 250,000 acres of lawn now established across the state. Well, there's just nothing in this lawn for the three-way dance of, the dance of flowers and pollinators. There's nothing in it. Even the foundation planting is pretty barren for pollinators. They have no interest in conifers or trees like Japanese maples. And they certainly can't make hidey holes in the mulch. It's too dense for them. They need more open soil. So this is how not to attract pollinators. I think probably most of you have lawns more like this. that provide food and shelter, resting and nesting places, nectar and pollen, and foliage for the moth and butterfly larvae. The moths and butterflies can be a little particular about what they eat because most plants don't want to have their leaves eaten. They do want to have their pollen moved around. So it's in their interest to have bees visit them and drink their nectar. That's part of the deal. They do not think it's in their interest to have their leaves all chewed up by caterpillars. So most of them are pretty distasteful to most caterpillars. And the reason we have caterpillars and butterflies is that they, in fact, have figured out ways to eat leaves and get away with it. Get around the toxins that plants provide to use to protect themselves. So any place you've got around your property that's a little bit like this, you know, not too well groomed, with a little open, loose soil and maybe some bare logs and hollow logs and pithy stems, that's good. And if you have, this is the rule of thumb, if you have 3 kinds of flowers in spring, 3 kinds of flowers in high summer, and 3 kinds of flowers in late summer, then you're providing a balanced diet that will keep them interested in your restaurant through 3 seasons. This is kind of like if you walk 10,000 steps, you'll be healthy. It's just a rule of thumb. And most places, you don't even have to plant anything and you will have 3 of each in Connecticut. But anyway, it's nice to think about what you're providing in each season. And you want to provide food for the butterfly and moth larvae. The most important thing is to not have endless turf and to minimize the use of chemical herbicides and pesticides that will kill the pollinators that would like to be in your yard. Just leave places that are not mowed against stone walls or at edges of woods, and you will automatically get goldenrods and asters and many, many other wildflowers. Gardening in the traditional sense is optional, but earth stewardship is not, says Doug Talamy, who is an entomologist at the University of Delaware and has a great deal to say about how we can help pollinators. So, but reducing turf is simply a matter sometimes of drawing a line at the edge of our woods or between at a border somewhere and saying, no, I'm not going to mow beyond that line. Just let it go. And then you start looking for pollinators. I'm starting to look now. There are 3 places to look. You think ground level first, and here's ground level. But we should also bear in mind that you might find them at shrub level and tree level. This is the thing that I've learned that I find very exciting. Last March 22nd, 367 days ago, I was just looking at a patch of moss in my backyard under a tree, and I saw these absolutely beautiful little minor bees coming out. Each one is the size of a housefly. But it was 50 degrees out and sunny and mild, and out they came. What on earth were they going to eat? It looked like it looks today, I mean, except that the sun was shining. Everything's gray and brown. Well, at this season, at the ground level, there are a few wildflowers. The bluets have started. I saw the first bluets this week. Galore the ground will be blooming in a day or so, 1 or 2. And even though it's not a native wildflower, it's one of the best available for the emerging bumblebee queens. They come out of their burrows very soon. As soon as we get 55 degrees, they're going to be coming out of their burrows where they've been hibernating all winter. And the first thing they want is nectar. They got to feed themselves before they can start making a family. And dandelions, again, they're not native, but they are used by emerging andrenid mining bees. And here's, I love the bloodroot, which is one of our first truly native wildflowers. And I wait for it all winter. And then when it comes out of the ground, I wait. Oh, do you see? There's the bee. the video is moving because I'm breathing and trying to be very quiet and not disturb that bee. But it has found the bloodroot, yay! And I get pussy toes in the yard. You probably do too. It will grow anywhere that you don't mow too closely. And it's the host for the American painted lady. American lady and the painted lady butterflies. And I like to leave violets growing in the lawn and at edges because they are the larval hosts for the great spangled fritillaries that will show up later in the summer. Asters also will grow in any New England soil that's not heavily turfed because their seeds are everywhere and they've got rhizomes under the surface, and they are the hosts for the pearl crescents. But there's just not that much going on at ground level, honestly. A few bluets and a few dandelions isn't going to cut it for a large population of pollinators. So then you realize, got shrubs too. And this is what saves them, of course. What saves them is lots and lots of pollen up above our heads in many cases. The wild pussy willows are very often pretty high up, but they produce a tremendous amount of pollen. And so do the spice bushes, which are host for the spice bush swallowtail butterflies. And the high bush blueberries will be out in April. And they're beloved by bumblebees. This one you can see has been bitten into by a carpenter bee. The carpenter bees can't fit inside that blossom, and so they just chew right through it and rob the nectar. But this is the real thing. To me, when I realized, okay, so I don't even have that many shrubs around my yard. I do have plenty of one pussy willow and a few spice bushes. But what everybody's got in Connecticut is red maples in the neighborhood. And these are insect pollinated. They produce nectar, they produce pollen in vast amounts. So that after the last glaciation, what came back first was trees, and what came first back were the conifers and then the wind-pollinated trees, the oaks. But when the maples came, that was an opening, I think, for the bees, because now there was a large source of pollen and nectar available in March. Well, spring goes on, and we get the meadows of all kinds of beautiful things, which I sort of cruise through. But these are all weeds. You don't have to plant these. If it's got a green title at the top, this is a native or naturalized wildflower that you don't have to plant. It's just going to be there. In this case, the golden Alexanders, it'll be in a wet place. And it's a host for a black swallowtail butterfly. You all know dogwoods. They are a native understory tree. We can plant them in our yards, but they might be in the neighborhood anyway if you have woods.
We have a question here, Carrie. Are native high bush blueberries deer resistant?
I don't see any deer depredation on our high bush blueberry. What you have to worry about is, if you want berries, you have to worry about the birds later on. But I don't see any deer browsing. Not to say that that it could never happen, because deer will eat anything. And once again, in the spring, it's the trees. It's the trees that produce the largest quantities of nectar and pollen. Tulip tree is a flowering tree. It's a butterfly larva host, and it's also a great source when it flowers of pollen and nectar. Sassafras, again, another flowering tree in the spring. Huge quantities of food. Of course.
Now this is my question, Carrie, sorry. Do all of the swallowtails have the two eyes on the top of their head?
Well, they're different. Those aren't really eyes. They're just decorative markings. They're scary.
Yeah, the mimic eyes, yeah.
The real eyes are someplace else.
Yeah.
They're just there to scare predators. And yeah, here are two examples. The I don't think it's true of all of them, at least two. Everything with a green title, where it says May trees and green, that means this is just going to happen. You don't have to plant a tulip tree. There's probably a tulip tree nearby in Connecticut, eastern Connecticut. If it's got purple at the top, this is things you can do. One thing you can do, if you've got your basic foundation planting like this, you don't lose the mulch right away if you want to attract pollinators. Just plant flowering ground covers instead, and maybe extend the area around your walkway like this with ground covers and shrubs and bulbs. Right away, you're going to have a good restaurant for spring. The sphinx moths will come and visit the moss flocks. And if you have focal points in your gardens, whether they're rocks or bird baths or sheds, something else, anything in your garden that's a thing you can't walk through, you don't need it to be turf. You can make a little garden around it with flowering plants that will attract pollinators. And if you've got a vegetable garden, you can surround it with marigolds and thyme, all sorts of things, sunflowers, and that will also be attractive. In the spring, the bulbs are not even native to this. Most of the spring bulbs in your garden are not native to this continent, mostly from Eurasia, but the bees use them because they're there and they have what they need. At the very least, the nectar is helpful, and you might like the pollen too. I find them on daffodils and hyacinths. It's a nice queen bumblebee. See how big she is? The queens are large insects when they come out. And here's another spring bulb, one of my favorites because its pollen is blue. Look at those anthers. And when a bee with pollen baskets gets into the scylla, its pollen baskets are also blue, which is absolutely adorable. And the Andromeda, my Andromeda is in bloom right now, and there are no bees today because it's a crummy day, but tomorrow I think they'll be buzzing. Can you hear them? So all of your spring ornamental shrubs have pollen and nectar. And even the ones that are not native are very attractive to a lot of bees and mostly the early spring bees, the vernal bees. The lilacs and fothergilla, viburnum. This is a native one, actually. By June, by the time this is in bloom, where there was one large queen bumblebee foraging in April, you'll now see 5 or 10 smaller bees, her first brood. So by June, her first brood is out, and they are also, she's now staying underground, and they're bringing her pollen and nectar day in and day out to make more baby bees. And that's the way their summer will go. The colony will expand exponentially from one queen, one mated queen, to anywhere between 200 and 400 bumblebees. And then we get to high summer, June and July. And once again, you can just let some things go, like the fleabane. You don't have to mow it all. That's a lot of pollen and nectar. And the carpet will happen without your doing much. All these green titles tell you this is just going to happen. We've got clover. It's naturalized since the colonists started planting it here 400 years ago. And if you don't mow it too low, it will attract your friends, the bumblebees. And it can be beautiful too. In the old days, clover lawn was considered a beautiful thing by humans as well as by bees. The red clover is especially attractive to pollinators with long proboscises because they can get way into those tubular flowers. plant strawberries. You don't have to plant these. Probably if you have a sort of a weedy spot, they might just be there anyway. Daisies. And here's, of course, the iconic wildflower of summer, the common milkweed, that is the host for the monarch butterfly caterpillars. If there's a caterpillar munching on one of these leaves, on the underside. And we get the silky dogwoods that grow all around the lakes and streams around here. Huge sources of nectar and pollen, much bigger than anything you could plant, unless you plant them, you know. But shrubs and trees produce the biggest bounty. Winter berries are fabulous. You can see the pollen falling right off of the plant, off of the flowers, right down onto the leaves. It's scattered everywhere. Bee heaven. This looks like it's either a sweat bee or a leafcutter bee, I'm not sure which. You got the arrowwood. Now, this is a planted spirea, and you can see that it's got pink pollen, because if you look at the bumblebee's pollen basket, it's pink. Here's the tulip tree in bloom. The nectar can be a ½ inch deep. I have stuck my finger in these flowers and it comes out sticky, gooey, and it's unbelievably rich, like a syrup. So these are things you can plant. Sedums make very good ground covers. The bulbs are attractive. That's Baptisia. I'm going to go fairly quickly through these because I don't want to keep you all too late. Catmint is a very favorite. And rhodes for both the butterflies. Now, by now, we've got some tiger swallowtails actually flying in June. These are the ones that were just in the spice bush is eating the foliage back in April. Nine barks are very good. Look at that clear winged sphinx moth. You can see the sky right through its wings. It's so beautiful. The ladies are out in June. Silver spotted skippers. And here we're back to the wild stuff now. Yep.
We had a question about the most common bees in Connecticut.
The most common ones are the impatiens, the Bombus impatiens, which is the common eastern bumblebee, I think. Common meaning the most one you're going to see the most of. There are lots of smaller bees that are in large numbers, and you might not see them. I don't know about all the numbers, actually. I have to say that. So I'm going to, because it's now 20 of 6, I'm going to sort of power through here just to give you an idea of how the seasons go. Wild stuff. Wild stuff. Planted thyme. Oh, planted zinnias. Now, if you only plant one annual in your garden, make it a zinnia, because these composite flowers attract butterflies like crazy, and they keep producing flowers for several months. They might start in July and not stop until October. So they're very good. So are sunflowers, huge nectar and pollen sources. And these are some of my favorites. I love the squash bees that specialize on the squash plants. They have come here from their original homes in Mexico, came with Native Americans, where who developed the squash as a cultivated crop in Central America. And as they moved north, squash bees did too. They didn't know that, but squash bees came along too, and they're wonderful. So this is just a little story I threw in the middle. Last summer at the Andover community gardens were started in the middle of a schoolyard, but just a bunch of turf that gets mowed once a week. And a month later, I'm finding bumblebees. Now, where are the bumblebees coming from? If you look at the periphery of that schoolyard, tons of untended habitat. It's just wild. Bumblebees only, 100 feet away from this garden. And sure enough, they did their business. And we got fruit. So July is butterfly month. You're going to see butterflies on all sorts of plants. It's also the end of the tree flowering season. Basswood, Tilia americana, is like the richest, I think, the richest draw for the large population of bees that now exist, because you know those bumblebees have been getting, the population's been getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And honeybee populations are getting bigger and bigger too. Everybody's getting bigger and bigger. And in the old reports, 19th century and early 20th century reports about basswood, people said that you could hear them, the bees humming a mile away from a basswood tree. I find there's always too much traffic noise. I can never hear the hum that far away, but once you get up close, it is like a blender. It's really exciting. And every single flower's got a bee on it, practically going up 60, 70 feet into the air. And after that, we don't have any more flowering trees after July. So what are they all going to do? We got bigger and bigger numbers. Ha ha! We got shrubs. We've got the button bush. Native. We planted these in our backyard, but they grow along every stream and pond nearby. And you got the goldenrods and the asters. And the thing with them is they're just so numerous. If you've got, you don't get one goldenrod, you get a field of goldenrods. You don't get one aster, like you got, you know, maybe you have 10 hyacinths in your spring garden. You could have an acre of, you know, uninterrupted goldenrod in the fall. And on the power lines we do. So this is what happens. The early spring pollinators are interested in the ground level wildflowers to the extent that they can find them. They will go for the shrubs, but they depend, I think, heavily on the trees. And the late spring trees too, the sassafras and the tulip trees, and then come the basswood trees. And late summer, it's not about the trees anymore. Those trees are about ready to shed their leaves. They're not producing any kinds of flowers. It's all about the goldenrods, the composites, the goldenrods, asters, Joe Pye weed, ironweed, and in our gardens, you know, all sorts of composites. I find even in early October, still got zinnias going. And there's a black swallowtail, which probably used some golden alexanders at the periphery of somebody's property in a wet spot last spring. Oh, still have some nasturtiums at the very end of September. I eat them in salad. I go out every night harvesting nasturtium flowers in late summer to put in the salad, also a few leaves. So I eat along with the pollinators. I get all these butterflies. Who is this? Well, if this were a live presentation, you'd tell me, but I'll have to tell you. It's a great spangled fritillary. And here we have, guess, on the left a monarch, and on the right a tiger swallowtail, painted lady. We know this is a bee with baskets, and it's a honeybee. These are not bees. I wish that we were doing this live and you could all raise your hands and say, oh, there's a drone bee and a calligrapher bee. But I mean, not bee, fly. By October, the bumblebees have produced a generation, not of workers who are out foraging all the time to bring back pollen for baby bees. Now they've produced a generation of virtually equal numbers of males and females. And they've done the mating game. And it's kind of over at frost. By that time, the only survivors will be the mated females who are burrowed underground. The fourth generation monarchs are nectaring. They're flying through our yards on their way to Mexico. Other butterflies and moths are laying eggs that will overwinter. And life continues mostly underground or in the leaf litter. So what do we do to help them get through the 4th season of the year, the hardest season for all living things? Well, we leave them places to rest and recuperate from their summer work underground, not cleaning up the yard, not raking up all the leaves, because that's where they're going to fold themselves in, and they're going to dig into the soft soil in their gardens. It's just another picture of leaving things be. It's a new aesthetic. In the old days, gardeners were all taught at the end of the summer, cut everything down, right down to the ground, make it clean. But the new aesthetic is leave it for the pollinators until the 50-degree days come back in March. Now here we are in March, and the 4th generation of monarchs has already left Mexico and is headed north. I believe they've landed in Texas. And the early vernal bees are waiting for air temps over 50. I've seen a few bees already when we had over 50 degrees. The minute it pops down below 50, they're not flying. But they will again, probably tomorrow. And that is the end of my presentation. And I will be happy to answer questions if people have them.
So we've got a couple in the chat that I want to make sure we don't forget. A question about DIY insect hotels. So providing some housing habitat, you know, with like the tubes versus, you know, the boxes and all those things. And specifically on like the location, shady versus sunny. Yeah.
Well, if you're going to build any sort of hotels, it should be in semi-shade anyway. You don't want them to heat up too much because the occupants would get too overheated. They don't have air conditioning. So, you know, under a dappled tree is perhaps a nice place at the edge of your property. Yeah. I don't actually provide any housing, so I don't have a lot to say about it. But I do look for places where they want to be and where they make homes, and it tends to be in those most neglected areas. They're looking for places you're not going to find unless you go looking. Underneath shrubs, underneath trees, that's where they tend to want to be. So if you want to make housing for them, those are the places to go.
I have another question about, like, when do you clean up your garden? Is there a particular time of the year that's better considering these pollinators are there? Yeah. Well,
the rule of thumb is after there have been 3 days at 50 degrees. And we've had those already, and bees are out. It means that the ones that overwintered in the stalks of grass or, you know, goldenrod stalks, pithy stems, they're out and about already. And so you can cut those down. And as for the ones that roll up in the leaf litter, I give them maybe another day and then just start raking like crazy. Yeah, it's really that time. It's right about now that you want to clean up from last year. Yes. In Connecticut.
Just scoping around for more questions here. Also, if you have another question and you'd like to come off of mute, feel free to do so. And we can just do like the hand raising feature. It's down that reactions button on the bottom bar of your Zoom. That way we don't have everybody talking at the same time.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I had a question about monarch caterpillars.
Yep.
Is that something you're very familiar with?
Yeah, I have watched them pretty intensely for the past 5 years, yeah.
Okay, great. I usually hatch them, or sometimes hatch them, but usually take the caterpillars and you know, grow them into butterflies. Mm-hmm. And I've always had some pretty good success, but last year there were a few that went into their J shape and made their chrysalis, but they never came out. It was almost like they rotted inside. Have you ever seen that before?
Oh, well, that happens, yeah. They don't have 100% success rate just because they get to that point. No, all kinds of things go bad in you know, biological systems. They may have an internal parasite that just went in chrysalis with them and ate them out. You know, that kind of thing happens.
Okay.
And you can't
All
feel bad about it. You can't feel bad if they're not all successful.
Okay, thank you. Is
Yeah.
that helpful to the butterflies as a species to raise them, or am I doing more harm than good, do you think? I mean, mostly they're successful.
Yeah, I think if they're successful, you're doing more good than harm, for sure.
Okay.
Yeah. I feel as though it's sort of like feeding the birds. We don't want the birds to be dependent on us. We enjoy inviting the birds to our home so that we can see them. But we don't want to think that they depend on us. And I don't think we want the monarchs to really believe that they depend on us to bring them into their homes. All they really need is habitat out there.
All right.
And they've been managing this for a long time. The numbers fluctuate a lot. As of 2 years ago, it was considered that the western population of monarchs was virtually extinct. And then last year they had a good year. Because they can increase their numbers exponentially. Any one female can lay 200 eggs or something. So the best thing we can do is not kill them and not cut down all their habitat.
Thank you very much.
Plus, I always think like, man, if you don't have to mow as much, that's a win, right?
It is, it's a different aesthetic. If you're a gardener, not mowing feels wrong at first, and then after a while you realize, oh my God, there's so much color in here because the weeds produce flowers, and they're colorful, and they move in the breeze, and there's all kinds of stuff to look at. There's life in them. There's, you see the caterpillars, you see the butterflies and the bees. So over time, leaving unmowed areas, it becomes a more entertaining yard for you. She said, Carrie said. So it has for me.
All right, we have a question from Lori G.
Hi, Carrie. Hey. So, I'm sorry I was late, so I don't know if you talked about this at all, but I did just catch up quickly. Someone had asked about different species of bees, and I know that you have identified different species. I just wondered if did you?
Well, I don't go down to the species level usually. A couple of species, mostly just types, because bees are hard. Entomology is a tough field, and a lot of bees can only be distinguished with a microscope, and I don't do that. I don't catch them and put them under the microscope. You can tell a lot about which group a bee is from by its size and its degree of fuzziness, where the fuzz is, the shape of its face, the shape of its eyes, things like that. And I feel reasonably confident. I feel totally confident about carpenter bees and bumblebees and honeybees. And then there's a whole group of minor bees. There's a whole group of mason bees, a whole group of sweat bees. I'm happy to say that's a sweat bee. I don't even go to genus level sometimes. So no, I'm not an expert at different kinds of bees, but I see many, many, many kinds over the course of the summer. And some are early ones, some are middle summer ones, and then some only I find in the later part of the summer.
And what about you said something about some are small and you don't see them?
Oh, so there are some very tiny bees. Yep. The smallest bees are to a carpenter bee like a human to a whale. I mean, wow. The smallest ones are like 2 millimeters long.
Wow.
They really exist, but you don't see them.
And you probably talked about like there's also flies and wasps that are pollinators, and that little video of the goldenrod, it looked like there were a ton of different, I'm not sure how many bees there actually were,
There were a lot of flies on that one. That was a lot of flicker flies in the fall, but that's just, I mean, it's just such an amazing number that I like the video.
Yeah.
But everybody likes goldenrod. You see all the species on goldenrod. Everybody loves goldenrod. I mean, and there are many species of goldenrod, and each one it can be specialized on by a different kind of pollinator.
Another plant that I get just hordes of pollinators on is mountain mint.
Yeah, me too. We could be here till 10 p.m. looking at individual pictures of bugs on flowers. I really wanted to skip most of the ones I have because of time limitations.
Everybody loves goldenrod unless you've got allergies.
Unless you got, goldenrod, amazing. I've been trying to identify all the species of goldenrod on our property alone, which is an old farm, you know, the development built on an old farm, and it's just, there are at least 10 species of goldenrods alone.
We have a question from Sandy Tosi.
Hi, Mandy's husband. And I had asked a question of, that Bryan responded to. I did separately. I just wanted to get your opinion on this too, ma'am, about planting cultivated flowers and things versus native flowers and plants. And I addressed that, but I just wanted to know if you had anything to add.
Oh, do both. If you don't like gardening, you'll be fine if you don't garden. Just don't mow as much and don't use pesticides. If you do like to garden, once you're interested in attracting pollinators, you'll want to plant more things for their benefit so that you can enjoy them and they can enjoy them. It's a mutual thing. That's it. If you're a gardener, you're going to figure out which things draw them and it'll make you happy. So both.
Part of my response also was that planting natives will also benefit other native wildlife, right?
Yes.
So
yes,
forsythia versus maple leaf viburnums.
Right. The seeds and fruit produced by native plants will be eaten by native animals and birds. Yes.
So even native can access cultivated flowers or what have you. I mean, their nectar would still be good.
Nectar is nectar. As far as I can see, it's like soda. It's just sugar.
Okay.
It's sugar water. And it doesn't seem to be that anybody specializes on certain kinds of nectar particularly. That's my impression, and I might be wrong about that. But it seems to be that nectar is like an almost all-purpose sugar substance. It doesn't turn anybody off, everybody loves it. Meaning, you know, wasps and bees and flies and butterflies. Everybody loves nectar.
So we've got a couple of other questions here. I was wondering the same thing. Why is it called a sweat bee?
Oh, let's just call it a sweat bee because apparently it is attracted to sweat. So it might land on you if you're out gardening and you're feeling sweaty. I mean, maybe you're a little salty and it wants the salt for its.
Like the sweet and the salty, sweet and savory. Also, can bloodroot be propagated by the average gardener?
Yes, it can. Unlike something like lady slipper, which has really very fussy demands for mycorrhizal connections underground. It seems to me is that every time I've transplanted bloodroot, it has taken. Wherever I put it, there it grows and prospers and spreads here in Connecticut.
Yeah, so maybe part of that is a non-sanitary transfer, right? Try to get some of the soil around the roots.
I always take it with a bunch of soil because you're digging down to get the bloody rhizome under the soil, you know. So you dig a chunk of soil with it and dig a hole and put your chunk of dirty bloodroot in there, and if it's happy, it will do fine. And the flowers are pollinated by bees, but it also spreads by the rhizomes.
Right. Any other questions here? Got some recommendations also. If you haven't checked the chat, some folks are sharing some resources, some things about insect hotels, about rearing monarchs.
Wonderful. I think it's all about sharing. You know, everybody. I'll just close by sharing some of my favorite resources. This is one book by Heather Holm, and it's absolutely fabulous. You know, all the bees and what they like and all that, and how to identify them. It's a great book. And also Attracting Native Pollinators by the Xerces Society. This is an excellent reference. And Anurag Agrawal's Monarchs and Milkweed is also a fantastic book. Really a great read. I couldn't put it down when I first read it, and I read it over and over.
All right, the last closing question.
Okay.
Right? It's, which I really like. It's a perfect like bang for your buck, right? If you could only plant one or a small group of native shrubs for pollinators, what would you plant? And of course, it depends on your yard and the sun and the shade and all of that. But
well, I'm native to this area. I would say that if you have a wet area, winterberry. Partly because it will also feed the birds so nicely. They love the red berries. And it is so pollen and nectar rich early in the season. So I would go for that. Nine bark is also terribly attractive. It's not native here, but it's a great pollinator plant. It's native to further south.
Perfect. So thank you so much, Carrie. Thanks everybody for coming along and participating.